With the declaration by Reverend Moon of the end of church era, there were UC clerics who strove to protect that very institution and took the movement in a divergent direction, building the Unification Church into a religion. Welcome to the Anti-Liars, where we always seek the truth and dispel the lies. Greetings, I am your host, Howard Self. Today we begin a new series on How Did We Get Here?, where we will explore more deeply the core turning points that changed the course of the Unification Church, or now known as the Family Federation for World Peace and Unification, leading it from a prosperous, charismatic-led, messianic powerhouse to an organization on the brink of bankruptcy, both financially and spiritually. There are a growing number who even say that we are seeing the end of the UC or Family Federation. Before we begin, make sure you hit the subscribe button and share this video. In this series, we're going to look beneath the surface, beyond the rumors, the politics, and the institutional facade, to expose the truth about what really happened to bring about such a startling and disastrous decline. There is always a starting point of deviation, or a small crack that grows eventually into a deep divide. And today we will be answering the question, how did we get here and with whom did it start? Today's topic, appropriately, is the first and greatest sin of the UC clerics and their rejection of God's providential mandate. How did something that began based upon a world-changing revelation, a living expression of God's heart, become entangled in bureaucracy, control, and confusion? The root of this corruption of the original vision lies in the UC clerics' rejection of God's providential mandate given by Reverend Sun Myung Moon, the founder. In 1994, when Reverend Moon pronounced the, quote, end of the church era, unquote. Those who were in position to discern the meaning of that pronouncement, namely the UC leadership, failed to unite with the direction he gave, and in so doing, blocked the membership from knowing of its importance. The 40 years wilderness course had ended, but they refused to cross into the new providential age, that is, the completed testament age, also known as the Age of Settlement. The very leaders who should have advanced the messianic mission instead clung to their power base, the church, resisted transformation, ultimately disobeying heaven and leading the members to do likewise. Reverend Moon himself, after he had found out how treacherous the UC leaders had been in blocking the providence, declared them to be, quote, worse than Lucifer, unquote. In his latest videotaped Hunduke, just weeks before his passing, let us watch this astounding video given directly to many of those responsible for the failure to, quote, in the church, unquote.
어머니 아버지도 하나 돼가지고 지금까지 어머니 아버지 아들 딸이 지금까지 내버려서 사탄성의 너희들 발 밑에 들어가가지고 자기 아들도 축복받았더니 축복이 천국 못 들어갈 그 아들딸 중 살고 선생님 아들딸을 밟아치웠더니 사슬을 했죠. 망국지정들이야. 그걸 추려가지고 아벨 중심사가 만들기 위해서는 선생님의 아들도 선수의 가정이 완전히 짓밟힌 거예요. 너희들은 무슨 굶어 죽기 전에 교회가 없어서는 안 된다고. 교회에서는 교회가 도둑질에다가 자기 아들, 딸 먹이기에 수고했던 사람들이 천국들은 하나도 없습니다. 선생님이 있으니 자기 아들, 딸 희생시키면서 가인이 죄 가운데 축복받은 것이 이게 천국 들러도 못 가. 너희들한테 1000만 대 빚을 산채로 바다에 물보고 죽여도 자기 아들들의 부를 수 없는 비참한 그 아들, 딸 중에서 모아지고 부모님도 봤으면 부모님 아들, 딸까지 묶어가지고 밟아 치웠던 마음대로 세상에 너들 같은 필요 없었어. 루시엘보다 더 무서운.
From this video of Reverend Moon's last Hunduke, there are a few important parts I would like to highlight. First, Reverend Moon chastises the leaders for saying they need to have a church no matter what. He continues on to reprimand the leaders for trampling on his family, which is, of course, the true family. He mentions this point over and over again. Quote, "You trampled on my children for your sake." Quote, "You will not be able to enter the kingdom of heaven because of your sins. You trampled on my children for your own sake." Unquote. And quote, "I sacrifice my sons and daughters for you. I even blessed you." Unquote. And finally, "True parents suffered for the sake of your miserable sons and daughters, and yet you trampled on my sons and daughters at will." Unquote. Reverend Moon is clear that what is important is not the church infrastructure. What is important is true family. And from Reverend Moon's words, even from the early days of his work, he was clear that the starting point for God's kingdom of heaven on earth is a family, a God-centered true family. That will be the starting point for a God-centered tribe, society, nation, and world. True family is the root and starting point for the settlement of God's ideal, and thus was the most central pillar of our faith and our movement. It is the true family that the leaders trampled on and instead uplifted the church institution. The second theme from this video is about Reverend Moon's anger towards the leaders. He used the word, quote, "stole," unquote. He pointed out that those who stole from the church, quote, "to feed your own children," unquote, will not be able to get into heaven. What do you think he was referring to? We know the all too common corrupt ways of many leaders, coveting position, living in comfort or luxury from being in a position of power over a following, and taking resources, including the donations from members, to use for their own personal and family gains. This kind of church system is not what Reverend Moon wanted to preserve. Why do you think he told leaders and members to leave their positions, get out of the church, go back to their hometowns and do home church and tribal messiahship? Why do you think Hunduke was started? Hunduke was started because both Reverend Moon and Dr. Moon realized that the UC leadership was not guiding the membership correctly. So through Hunduke, blessed central families could study Reverend Moon's directions for themselves, not being forced to rely on UC leaders to know the most important aspects of the Providence. Then later, national messiahship was directed. What were all these directives for? Again, Reverend Moon was asking all members and all leaders to go back out into their villages and hometowns, to become a true God-centered, blessed family. Then, through your family as the witness, study the very words and teachings of Reverend Moon, not through someone else's interpretation, but study and share Reverend Moon's direct words and teachings and spread the movement. He wanted all of us to become co-creators of God's kingdom of heaven here on earth. A third theme that repeats is Reverend Moon's heartache toward how his son Hyunjin had been treated by these same leaders. He lamented, quote, "You traitors, you threw away my son, who was working to build everything centered on the able UN. You completely trampled on my son," unquote. Brothers and sisters, I hope this makes it clear about how leaders treated Reverend Moon's heir that he had recognized as the fourth Adam and leader in the new age of settlement of God's ideal. Now, I would like to return to the 40-year wilderness course that we touched upon earlier. In 1994, Reverend Moon declared the completion of the 40 years wilderness course, a providential period that paralleled the Israelites' journey from Egypt to Canaan. Reverend Moon, too, saw the ending of the wilderness course in 1994 as the starting point for the UC to enter a wholly different providence. As the Israelites left bondage in Egypt to seek out the promised land, Unification members were to leave their old culture, a culture centered on the structure of the Unification Church, and together with Reverend Moon and his family, enter the settlement age. Unification members were to finally become free of the walls and limitations of a structured church and religion, and be free to aid Reverend Moon as he took up his original messianic mission. That mission was to help free all of humankind from the shackles of fear and ignorance, and to create a God-centered civilization. From this perspective, it is easy for us to see that the 40 years of HSA UWC was a detour, never intended to continue after the 40 years wilderness course. To continue to maintain the church in this time, as many UC leaders did, actually meant to block God's providence and Reverend Moon's main mission. Perhaps it is easier to see now why he called those same leaders who did so as being, quote, worse than Lucifer, unquote. To repeat, because it is of central importance in understanding our movement today. When that 40-year course ended and a worldwide foundation was established, Reverend Moon declared that his true mission, his messianic mission, was now beginning. It was now time to build a civilization that would represent God's kingdom of heaven here on earth. In order to do that, the church had to come to an end. However, For many UC leaders, they would not let go of the church infrastructure. They had conveniently placed themselves as intermediaries for the membership, and those bureaucratic positions yielded much power and access to resources for them. They had created a culture of absolute obedience, not to God, but to themselves, and therefore enjoyed power, prestige, and luxury. Like the Israelites who feared the uncertainty of the wilderness and did not have the unwavering faith in God to understand His greater will for them, so too would many UC leaders during this transitional time. Those leaders could not let go of the comforts of power, prestige, and money. The members, too, clung to the security of the structured church for fear of the uncertainties that come with coming out of a religious institution and becoming co-creators with God. I would like to rewind a bit here. Although the end of church era was declared in 1994, Reverend Moon always knew his mission was bigger and not confined to the establishment of one religious body. With the rejection by key Christian leaders who could not understand nor recognize the mission and purpose of Reverend Moon's work, Reverend Moon had to pause on the larger civilizational work to build God's kingdom of heaven on earth because he first had to build his own global foundation upon which he could launch his real mission. But he taught about his vision, his purpose, and the larger providential landscape throughout his mission. Even from the very early years of his work, Reverend Moon spoke about building a world of peace, God's kingdom of heaven on earth. He spoke about God's most central purpose of creation and ideal, God's four-position foundation, manifested through an ideal family: God, Father, Mother, children. This family would have God's true love at the center and would realize all the realms of love and encapsulate all generations, representing the past, present, and future. Throughout the 70s, from the early years of his providential work here in America, this was a theme he continually spoke about. Here are some examples. God's Day, January 1st, 1977. Quote, "The kingdom of God on earth begins from the ideal family, not begins with a church." And again, January the 1st, 1978, Reverend Moon said, quote, "God has to look for one unit here on earth, which can be the basic starting point of his kingdom. That unit is one family," unquote. That was in his speech called "The Basic Formula for the Realization of the Kingdom of God on Earth." From this God-centered four-position foundation, Reverend Moon explained that God's love would expand from the family level to the tribe, society, nation, and to the world. He spoke continuously of building one world under God. Here are other examples of how this was a central part of what he spoke about from his early years in America. January 1, 1972, quote, "God's will is for progress to begin with an individual who becomes one with God and continues with a family who unites internally with that individual. It continues with a clan that is one internally with the family, a tribe that is one with the clan, and eventually a nation that is one with the tribe or race. In all past ages, the goal of the dispensation has been to find the completely God-centered nation, unquote. A very significant quote, December 4th, 1977, quote, "Then the entire world will come under God, and you shall be living in the kingdom of God here on earth," unquote. And finally, September the 22nd, 1978, quote, "Providential history aims to create ideal family-type relations on all levels from the individual to the world," unquote. As we can see from these quotes directly from Reverend Moon, he has emphasized the centrality of an ideal family to the fulfillment of God's providence. From that God-centered family, God's ideal will expand to the clan, tribe, nation, and then to the world. I want to say a few words to my fellow blessed families from my generation. I, like many of you, was in the Madison Square Garden blessing in 1982. In the 70s, we were taught and knew the importance of true parents, and that belief was the core of our faith. However, and this is very important, we did not truly recognize the centrality and importance of true family and true children. Now, we have to know that from the beginning, Reverend Moon's establishment of the true family made it possible for all other levels of civilization to be liberated step by step. But it was always to be centered on family, not on church. Reverend Moon famously foresaw the development of the Pan-Pacific Rim era, prophesying that Korea would be in the role of the third Israel, and the United States, as the fruit of Christianity, would stand as both second Israel and, being the one superpower after World War II, as the quote-unquote Rome of a new world civilization. That insight, which Reverend Moon expressed as early as 1974 in San Francisco, would later reappear almost word for word in his peace message number 13. So he had been talking about this providential mandate his whole time in the United States, from the 70s into way past the 2000s. I often heard leaders of the Unification Church describe the peace messages as a, quote, new revelation, unquote, something revolutionary. But that cannot be further from the truth. Peace messages do not have new content. They are a summary of the most essential core teachings of Reverend Moon. That is why he stressed the importance of studying the peace messages. It is important for me to show you how much the leaders misunderstood who Reverend Moon was, and that they did not understand his mission and direction. It is also very important for you to understand how the UC leaders misled the movement and often did not correctly translate Reverend Moon's key content into other languages, especially English. But let's be clear, Reverend Moon never came to create the Unification Church or any other institutional religion. However, with the declaration by Reverend Moon of the end of church era, there were UC clerics who strove to protect that very institution and took the movement in a divergent direction, building the Unification Church into a religion. Those of you who were part of the movement here in the United States may well remember from the earliest days when Reverend Moon first came here and the early rallies that were held, including those in New York and Washington, D.C., What was Reverend Moon's message? It was always about God, about humanity, and about our mission for the world. Let us look at a video clips of Reverend Moon at the famous Washington Monument rally in 1976.
결성된 미국은 통일 세계의 모형이니 미국의 날에 센 하나님의 축복은 미국만을 위한 축복이 아니라 하나님이 다 같은 자녀로서의 전 세계 형제 자매들에게 나눠 주어야 할 축복인 것을 확실히 알고 세계적으로 닦아놓은 기독교 기반 후에 세계 주도 국가로서의 책임을 다하고 태감받은 국가로서의 사명을 완수하여야 합니다.
The United States of America, transcending race and nationality, is already a model of the unified world. She must realize that the abundant blessings which God has been pouring upon this land are not just for America, but are for the children of God throughout the world. Upon the foundation of world Christianity, America must exercise her responsibility as a world leader and the chosen nation of God.
He centered his work on America because America played a critical role on the global level. This was the nation that expressed the epitome of Jesus' teachings, and through his work in America, Reverend Moon hoped to bring God's truth to all of humanity. We saw through Christian history that when the teachings of Jesus were embedded in civilization, they elevated the human condition. The key example of that is the notion that fundamental human rights and freedom come from God. It meant that all people have inalienable rights endowed to them by God, and therefore no other human or human institution could take those away. Today, this is almost taken for granted because it is such an accepted and almost given truth. Yet in history, this was not the case before the Declaration of Independence. Thus, Jesus' teachings were never meant to remain inside church walls, and God was never to be confined just within the realm of religion. God, his principles, and his values were to be infused in all aspects of society, from politics, education, culture, and economy, to the most foundational institution of society, marriage and the family. Thus, if you recall, the blessing movement transformed into an interfaith and cross-cultural movement standing for God's ideals, transcending race, religion, and nationality. Reverend Moon's mission was to awaken humanity to live as God's sons and daughters once more, to empower every person to stand as a co-creator with God. He was not seeking to create a church of followers, but to build a movement of sons and daughters who inherited and owned God's dream. Let us now return to the end of church era declaration that was made in 1994. By 1994, Reverend Moon is now 74 years old. Along with the end of the church, we see another shift that happened. Reverend Moon had raised up a son to lead the world into this new era. And in 1998, Yunjin Preston Moon was acknowledged as the heir to carry on the providential mantle as the central figure of this age. In the inaugural address of that 1998 event, Reverend Moon announced the opening of the, quote, era of the fourth Adam, unquote, and both recognized Dr. Hyunjin Moon as the fourth Adam and also gave his entire foundation over to him. You will now see a short clip of the 1998 inauguration event.
오늘 이와 같은 모임을 갖게 된 것은 통일교 역사에 있어서 혹은 선생님 일생에 있어서 처음 되는 기름의 날이라고 생각합니다. 뿐만 아니라 하나님의 소원이 있었다면 이런 날이 있기를 얼마나 고대했다는 걸 생각할 때 내 마음으로 깊은 감사를 하나로 배드립니다. 아담 가정에서 하나님이 일대려면 아담은 이되고 아담 아들들은 3대인데 3대를 못 본 것이 타락이고 3대 역사를 다시 일으키기 위한 것이 구원 섭리와 복귀 섭리의 완성을 생각할 때에 이 3대를 중심 삼고 하나님의 공적인 책임을 임명한다는 것은 천주사적인 이변이다. 희망의 한날로서 이들을 현진 앞에 갖게 해주는 것이다. 추가한다. 아멘. 고마운 것은 예수님이 30세에 비로소 가정을 이루겠다고 출발하던 그런 목적을 이루기 원합니다. 이제 세계 전체 가정들이 축복을 받아 가져가지고 나라를 넘고 세계를 갈 수 있는 축복의 환경을 개척한 후에 30세 못 되는 현진을 이와 같이 가정을 부회장을 세우는 것을 부모님으로서는 나로서는 기쁘게 생각한 거예요. 그게 기쁜 거예요. 살아가는 사람들을 흡수기 시작하고 이것이 마지막 페이지, 탕감복귀는 마지막 페이지. 사탄 혈통 단절해가지고 깨끗이 청산 후에 하늘의 직계 자네가 가정을 중심 삼고 제4차 아담 승리권을 이렇게 넘겨받을 수 있는 그 바톤을 여러분들은 출발이 시작하게 된다는 사실이 놀라운 거다. 여러분을 알아야 돼요.
It has always been my life's goal to ultimately aid my parents in building God's kingdom here on earth through the formation of God-centered families. And with this appointment, I can finally join them in their crusade.
얼마나 길 바라냐. 100대가 아니야. 1000대 만들을 바라. 낫길 바라냐.
Many of you might have seen this translated version by Peter Kim that was published in Today's World. In this comparison of Reverend Moon's original words as translated correctly versus the version printed in Today's World, you can see all the content that Peter Kim left out, including the essential points about Hyunjin's providential role. I would like to read to you two of the most critical passages that were left out of the translation. Here is the first one. After severing ties with Satan's lineage and clearing it away, you must understand how amazing it is that now God's direct Son is inheriting the baton to begin the victorious realm of the fourth Adam, centered upon his family. Who is Reverend Moon talking about? He's talking about his son Hyunjin Moon. Of course, that is left out by Peter Kim. And a second example, to me, very egregious examples. Only Hyunjin's children are fourth generation. They are the fourth generation. That's why you can receive the era of the fourth Adam through Hyunjin's family. As I've traveled around the country, many members say, where is it that Reverend Moon says exactly Hyunjin is the fourth Adam? Reverend Moon said it in the inaugural speech. Why did you not hear it? Peter Kim did not deliver it. And that makes all the difference. You're hearing the truth today, and now you know. Today's World magazine, which usually publishes the full speeches of Reverend Moon, in this particular case, in such an incredible event, chose to run just Peter Kim's rough and incomplete translation, as you have just seen. This is why the great majority of members did not understand the cosmic significance of this providential event, even though Reverend Moon said this is a cosmic event. This is a clear example of how certain elder Korean UC leaders hid very important information from the membership. After Reverend Moon had spoken at length in one part there, Rep. Peter Kim gave us only one sentence and left out all the content about Dr. Hyunjin Moon. And this one sentence has been a central part of many members' misunderstanding of what the realm of fourth Adam meant. The vast majority did not realize the realm of fourth Adam began with the fourth Adam, Dr. Moon and his family. Some leaders even went so far as to deceptively teach that the realm of fourth Adam meant that all members were now fourth Adam. Since when did God stop working through a central point? We can see that Reverend Moon's own actions exposed that teaching to be a lie. With this heavenly appointment, Reverend Moon began massive restructuring of the entire movement around Dr. Hyunjin Moon. A new generation of leaders closer to the age of Dr. Moon were soon assigned major leadership roles, replacing 36 couples and other elders. The only 36 couple elder that was kept in leadership was Reverend Chung Hwan Kwak. This too was for the sake of supporting Dr. Moon. It was not because Reverend Kwak had some special status, but because simply he was the father of Dr. Moon's wife, and Reverend Moon expected him to support Dr. Moon to lead the movement into the new age. Reverend Moon announced that all leaders under 40 are now under the leadership of Dr. Moon. Realizing that some of the remaining elders were older than 40, Reverend Moon even raised the age to 48 to include all leaders. Also, Dr. Moon was installed as the head of all providential organizations, and all leaders of various initiatives came under his realm of leadership as well. It was clear that Reverend Moon was placing Dr. Moon in charge of the entire movement and all of his foundation. Reverend Moon even made this clear to the leaders. On February 18, 2001, he said, quote, "When we had a meeting in Korea this time, I instructed that all leaders under 40 should absolutely comply with the orders of Hyunjin, who is the second generation. Well, didn't I give the special authority to do personnel changes and so on?" Unquote. Reverend Moon had made it clear to the other siblings of Dr. Moon. This is Reverend Moon speaking to his youngest daughter, Jungjin. On June 18, 2000, he said, quote, "Since your brother Hyunjin is leading the way, you have to treat him with an absolute standard. He cannot be compared with Injin, Yejin, Hyojin, or Sungjin. You should absolutely obey Hyunjin. I put him in my place. You have to know this." He even made it clear to Mrs. Hak Jahan. On February 18, 2001, Reverend Moon told her directly, quote, "Now the age of inheritance has come. The age of mother-son cooperation was the age of indemnity. However, once the way of father-son relationship is established, afterward, mother should also follow the anointed elder son." Unquote. Reverend Moon also held a very special ceremony to transfer the authority of the blessing to Dr. Moon. Please read along with me from a speech that Reverend Moon gave in September of 2000 concerning this transference of the blessing authority. The time is also coming that Hyunjin-gun can give the blessing in my place. Do you understand? The second generation will give the blessing in their parents' place here, and Hyunjin-gun, the elder brother, will do the same in the spirit world. Since Hyunjin-gun is the elder brother and Hyunjin-gun the younger, Hyunjin in the younger brother's position can give the blessing to you on earth, unquote. This transference of authority has never happened again. In order to reform the movement, Dr. Moon educated and challenged the leaders to align to the settlement age and leave their baggage of the UC era behind. He challenged all the members to become owners of God's ideal in their own right and pushed them to engage with society and live for the greater good. He educated blessed central families that their families would become the building blocks of the kingdom of heaven here on earth. He repositioned organizations to work on respective focus areas aligned to an overarching vision and providential goals. Dr. Moon launched various new initiatives to reform the movement into a powerful force that could move nations and impact the world. He made a massive push to engage the global foundations God had prepared for this providential age, and under Dr. Moon's leadership, the movement grew to new heights. I was a leader in various organizations during this time, and it was a very exciting time. Dr. Moon brought the smaller chapter-based collegiate programs together into a mighty international collegiate organization, World CARP. He equipped them with vision and perspective to become young leaders of character who could live for the greater good. He improved the Special Task Force program, developed a leadership pipeline, and built a 7-year course training for young people to raise the next generation to be owners of God's dream. Service for Peace was launched to emphasize the culture and lifestyle of living for the sake of others. And through the various organizations he led, from Youth Federation for World Peace, World Culture and Sports Festivals, to the Universal Peace Federation, Dr. Moon built the foundation from the ground up across all sectors of society. Networks of leaders, the Ambassadors for Peace, coalesced around the vision of one family under God and worked across all sectors in building a foundation around the world. Dr. Moon mapped out strategic goals for every organization, clarifying the end goal of one family under God and building clarity within every organization and initiative to align to these providential end goals. This clarity, driven into every organization by Dr. Moon, is what allowed each organization to reach new heights. By 2006, the foundation was built to launch a new initiative that would lead efforts for national transformation. The Global Peace Festivals launched around the world throughout 2007 and 2008. Dr. Moon and his wife embarked on an inaugural tour to work on building national-level foundations for God's providence. This was such an exciting time as Dr. Moon led the movement out of its religious box and transformed it into a global interfaith, intercultural movement that could lead the civilizational work to create God's ideal world. just as his father had intended, and as was expected of his messianic mission. There was so much hope for our blessed families. Our movement's foundations around the world were growing and receiving recognition from society. And there was so much energy and spirit in the second and third generations of the movement. Dr. Moon clearly had spiritual authority and the power and charisma to lead the movement in this new era. Moreover, it was clear Dr. Moon was aligned to the providential mandate and was determined to end the church so that the good news could be brought to all humanity beyond any one religion. We could see God working through all his efforts and how closely Reverend Moon and Dr. Moon worked as father and son together during this time in what Reverend Moon called, quote, the era of father-son cooperation, unquote. However, as Dr. Moon led these reforms, there were certain UC leaders who feared these changes because they did not want the church structure that they benefited from to erode. These leaders engaged in intentional misinforming and misreporting to Reverend Moon about the various initiatives of Dr. Moon, instigating tension and misunderstanding between Reverend Moon and Dr. Moon. Therefore, Dr. Moon's efforts were faced with resistance and obstacles from the beginning. However, because Dr. Moon was clear about the providential purpose and direction for the movement, he did not stop and continued his work, fueling tremendous growth and impact around the world. Even if Reverend Moon had misunderstood or even opposed these initiatives in the beginning, we always saw again and again that within a span of 3 or so years, he would do a 180 degrees turn and praise his son and his work. He would tell Dr. Moon how proud he was of him and even thank him, often saying, quote, what would have happened if you did not continue these initiatives, unquote. I myself watched the movement grow during these years under Dr. Moon's leadership. I feel so grateful that he did not stop despite the incredible opposition and efforts to spread misinformation about him and his work. Just imagine the tremendous opportunity that would have been lost had Dr. Moon not kept pressing forward to transition our movement. As this foundation continued to expand, for the UC leaders, it became clear that they were increasingly irrelevant to the unfolding providence in this new era. Their clerical position as intermediaries was threatened by the way Dr. Moon empowered blessed families to be the owners of God's dream in their own right. And it became crystal clear that Dr. Moon would do away with the church institution as his father had mandated. And the UC leaders were very scared of this fate. They sought to preserve their position by retaining the church hierarchy, and thus deviated from the providential direction and goals of Reverend Moon and Dr. Moon. They rejected the providential mandate to end the church, and they saw Dr. Moon as the threat. They sought to preserve their position by retaining the church hierarchy, and thereby deviated from the providential direction and goals of Reverend Moon and Dr. Moon. They rejected the providential mandate to end the church, and in doing so, they created a new religion separate from Reverend Moon's own mission. By holding on to the UC, they betrayed God. They betrayed Reverend Moon. They betrayed the heir, Dr. Moon, and they laid the seeds for the schism that would come in the 2000s. This blatant act of disobedience and betrayal is why this is the first and greatest sin the UC clerics committed. Remember in the Hunduke video that you saw earlier, Reverend Moon chastised the UC leaders severely, saying, quote, "You said you needed the church, but you trampled on my family and my son," unquote. Obviously, Reverend Moon was extremely upset that the leaders maintained the church because, as mentioned earlier, by maintaining the church after the end of the church proclamation had been reached and announced, the UC leaders were blocking God's providence and the messianic mission of Reverend Moon. I would like to introduce to you a prophetic letter and report that Dr. Moon presented to his parents in 2008 about the perilous situation of the movement. I would like to give some context about this letter and how significant it was. Dr. Moon's letter spoke about the urgent crisis the movement was facing in 2008. Dr. Moon understood how serious and critical the state of the movement had become, with UC leaders led by Mrs. Haq Jahan and his siblings attempting to maintain a church structure and take the movement in a divergent direction from the end of church era mandate. Dr. Moon conveyed and confirmed with his father the true and proper vision, direction, and purpose of the various entities within the movement. Reverend Moon not only agreed with the content of the letter, but he was also so amazed and completely blown away by the clarity in which Dr. Moon laid out the providential strategic goals, prophetic assessment, and direction for every part of the movement. In several instances, Reverend Moon publicly expressed how proud and overjoyed he was with Dr. Moon, and he had the letter read at Hunduke in March and April 2008. Remember, Hunduke was reserved for the study of Reverend Moon's words only. However, for several weeks, Reverend Moon chose to have this letter, written by his son, to be read during Hunduke to him and to the leaders and members gathered. And from there, Reverend Moon directed all leaders and members to read the letter because, as he said, this letter lays out the direction our movement needs to go. Mrs. Haq Jahan, Kukjin Moon, Shan Moon, and the UC clerics all heard the content of Dr. Moon's letter and recognized that Reverend Moon not only was endorsing the vision, strategy, and direction laid out in the letter, but intended to have Dr. Moon drive all the various providential initiatives in the way he laid them out in the letter. They felt very threatened and felt they had to take swift action against Dr. Moon. Shortly afterwards, Reverend Moon asked Dr. Moon to go to Latin America and visit the key nations there, which he did. While Dr. Moon was away in Latin America, Mrs. Haq Jahan, together with other clerics, maneuvered to take the leadership of Family Federation away from Dr. Moon. They wanted to install Shan Moon in that role and therefore officiated a rushed shotgun inaugural event on April the 18th, 2008, to which Dr. Moon was not informed or invited. However, it was very clear in Reverend Moon's mind that Family Federation remained under the leadership of the fourth Adam, Dr. Moon. How do we know that? Because that is what I Howard Self believe? No. From Reverend Moon's own words, in his speech at this inaugural event, Reverend Moon stated 16 times that the Family Federation remained under the realm of the fourth Adam. Remember, from Reverend Moon's perspective, Dr. Hyunjin Moon's providential role as fourth Adam superseded any one organization's position or title. For example, former international presidents of Family Federation, Sunjo Hwang and Reverend Chung Hwan Kwak, had organizationally superior positions to Dr. Moon, who was only the vice president of the Family Federation. However, both recognized, accepted, and gave deference to Dr. Moon. Why would a person in a superior position submit to someone who is organizationally inferior? It is because Dr. Moon was officially recognized as Reverend Moon's successor and acknowledged as the fourth Adam. Mere administrative and clerical positions do not supersede the Adamic figure's authority in a charismatic, messianic, and providential movement. Likewise, Reverend Moon clarified that point during Sean's inauguration. He clarified it 16 times. Therefore, this appointment of Sean Moon as Family Federation president was merely an appointment to one entity. Did Sean Moon act correctly upon Reverend Moon's clear words and desire for Family Federation to recognize Dr. Moon's overall leadership? He did not. Quite the contrary. I use the word maneuvered, quote unquote, because his motivation of taking Family Federation is revealed as he used his position to try to control communication to members through international memos coming from international headquarters, and continued his pattern of hostile takeovers of other entities directly under Dr. Moon's orbit, which would eventually lead to the schism in the entire movement. In future episodes, we will unveil more about how Sean Moon took advantage of the goodwill of both Reverend Moon and Dr. Moon and the ignorance of members. We will show how he staged an organizational coup d'etat, misleading members through misuse of the Family Federation apparatus to eventually create his own separate cult, calling himself the Second King, quote unquote. We will address the role Sean Moon and his siblings, Kukjin and Injin, played in precipitating the schism within the movement. I would now like to read a couple of the key passages from Dr. Moon's 2008 letter, which we have been talking about. Please note the heart and sincerity he had in writing to his parents. You can read the full letter by clicking on the link below. I will read to you now. It is important to note that this culture of heart be rooted in a God-centric love focused on Father's original purpose of realizing one family under God, and not a humanistic type of love which seeks to maintain coexistence and is without purpose. As I visited the field, although I know the suffering and often miserable state of our members, I encourage them to work harder for the fulfillment of God's dream, because I know it is the only way our blessed central families could be truly liberated and inherit the true legacy of parents, especially at this critical juncture of Providence. I have urgently tried to convey to them that we stand at a tipping point where our efforts could change the tide of history to align with the will of God. For this could be a time of great leadership and self-sacrifice for a greater prize to be had in the future, or at the same time could be a time of appeasement and self-interest to maintain our current foundation and forever doomed to be a pariah lost without direction. In other words, shall we lead the world back to God, or shall we forever remain a cult or new religion? No matter where I am, whenever I ask our members this question, they answer with a resounding yes to, quote, lead the world back to God, unquote. Therefore, I know that our blessed central families still have the ideal, visionary desire to fulfill the will of God, but they have been terribly misled, misguided, and misdirected, and frankly, misused. Father, the problem was not with our members, but with our leaders. Our blessed families still recognize and have a desire to be aligned to God's providence. But our church leaders, especially in the FFWPU, want them to be members of their church congregations, very similar to mainline Christian churches. I will read one final quote from this very important letter. It is important for our entire movement to seriously look at the direction and goal of divine providence. We are at a crossroads. The direction our movement takes today will determine the future. I too have felt the importance of this time and the urgency of building the right foundation and setting the right direction to align properly to providence. If we do, then the providential goals of restoring a nation and the eventual creation of an able UN are possible. However, if we don't, then we may be doomed to remain a cult. This choice that Dr. Moon presented in 2008 to Reverend Moon defines the spiritual crossroads of our movement, and it is the question I ask all of you today. Which path will you follow? Will you follow God's providence and come out of the church box? Or will you just remain members in an institutional church? Today, we investigated the first and greatest sin of UC leaders and their rejection of God's providential mandate. But this is just the beginning. There is much more to cover in upcoming episodes. After all, we've had 17 years of schism. We will look at the preponderance of evidence that shows how the UC leaders' disobedience unfolded step by step. And of course, we will reveal more of the lies that were presented to the members to keep them in the dark, and we will shed the light of truth that they tried to hide. I want to thank everyone who is following this podcast and for posting your comments and questions. I see that our first podcast has now close to 4,600 views, so it's clear there is interest and desire for explanations on what is going on in the Unification Church today. I invite you to please like and also to subscribe to the channel so you can be notified of upcoming episodes and receive updates of the latest developments in the Korean scandal and other developments concerning our movement. I also welcome the families from the Only Begotten Daughter and the Sanctuary Church to keep posting. Your detailed comments and questions give us more to talk about. In future episodes, we will be responding to some of the issues raised by our viewers. God bless you and your family.